The millionaire CEO sat alone in a crowded restaurant, lost in numbers and noise, until two little girls with identical blue eyes and a bucket of flowers stopped at his table and unknowingly unraveled his entire past. Nicholas Harrison sat alone at the corner table of an upscale Manhattan restaurant, his tailored navy suit still perfect despite the tension etched into his shoulders. The untouched espresso in front of him had long since gone cold, but he didn't notice. His mind was spinning with numbers, failed negotiations, and the gnawing sense that even after everything he had built, his empire, his reputation, his wealth, something essential was missing. The room buzzed quietly with conversation and clinking glassware, but he heard none of it. He was so far inside his head that when a soft voice interrupted him, it felt like a foreign sound. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" He blinked, slightly startled, and looked down to see two small girls standing at the edge of his table. They couldn't have been older than 6, identical except for the ribbons in their hair, one wore pink, the other blue. Their cheeks were flushed from the cold outside, their clothes a little too thin for the winter air. One of them held out a plastic bucket with a few wilted roses inside, her hand trembling slightly from either nerves or chill. Nicholas frowned, his first instinct irritation. Children weren't supposed to be working, especially not this late. He asked, not unkindly but sharply, "Where are your parents? Why are you out here selling flowers?" The girl with the pink ribbon spoke first. "Our mom is in the hospital. We're trying to help her." Her voice was clear, direct, and painfully sincere. The other girl nodded beside her, gripping the edge of the bucket tighter. For a moment, Nicholas just stared at them. The automatic part of his brain wanted to dismiss them, to drop a $100 bill on the table and send them away so he could return to his carefully constructed isolation. But then he looked closer. They had the same eyes as him. It wasn't just the blue, it was the exact same shade, icy and startling, eyes that didn't belong to children struggling to survive. And their features, softened by youth, of course, but there was a familiar curve in their chins, the same arch in their brows. His heart stuttered, just for a second, and he couldn't place why. He reached for his wallet and bought every flower they had. They smiled shyly, whispered "thank you," and turned to go, but something in him snapped. "Wait," he said, standing up, ignoring the dull ache in his lower back. "What's your mother's name?" The girls hesitated. Then the one with the blue ribbon said, "Sarah. Sarah Miller." The world tilted on its axis. That name hadn't passed his ears in 6 years. Sarah Miller. The one woman he had loved and lost, who had disappeared from his life without a word or a trace. His stomach twisted in a way he hadn't felt in a decade. He quickly gathered his coat, nearly forgot his phone on the table, and rushed out after them. "Where is she?" he asked, breath visible in the cold air. They told him the name of the hospital, not far from the restaurant. Without thinking, he called his driver and ordered him to reroute immediately. As the car pulled away, Nicholas stared at his own reflection in the window, those same blue eyes staring back, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about meetings or mergers. He was thinking about a woman he hadn't seen in over half a decade, and two little girls who looked just like him. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and something deeper, quiet suffering, tired hope, and sterile uncertainty. Nicholas walked through the automatic doors with his heart hammering against his ribs, a sharp contrast to the practiced calm he usually carried into boardrooms. He barely acknowledged the receptionist as he asked for Sarah Miller's room, his voice clipped and urgent. The name felt strange on his tongue, like something sacred that had been locked away too long. The woman behind the counter checked the system and gave him a room number, adding that visiting hours were nearly over. He thanked her absently and moved quickly down the hall, every step echoing louder in his ears than it should have. He reached the door and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, he considered turning back. What was he even doing here? Barging into the life of someone who clearly hadn't wanted him in it? But the image of the girl standing beside his table flashed through his mind again, those eyes, those faces, and something deeper than logic took hold. He pushed the door open quietly. The room was dim, the overhead lights turned off and only a small lamp casting a warm glow. Sarah lay in the hospital bed, her face turned toward the window. Her hair was longer than he remembered, but paler now, pulled back into a messy braid that had loosened around her face. She looked thinner, fragile in a way he had never seen before, as if the years had carved lines into her not from age, but from carrying too much on her own. Yet even in this weakened state, she radiated the quiet strength he remembered. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they focused on him, she blinked once, then again, disbelief spreading across her face like a storm cloud. "Nicholas," she said, and even her voice, hoarse, low, hit him like a punch to the chest. He stepped inside, gently closing the door behind him. "Hi, Sarah," he said, unsure what else to offer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He could see her trying to sit up straighter, though the effort clearly caused her pain. He moved instinctively toward her but stopped when she held up a hand. "What are you doing here?" Her voice carried more confusion than anger, but there was a guardedness to it that made him ache. "I saw them," he said quietly. "Two girls. Selling flowers outside a restaurant." Sarah closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, they were wet with something between guilt and resignation. "I told them not to go that far," she whispered. "They said your name," Nicholas continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sarah Miller. And then I saw them. Their faces. Their eyes." He let the sentence trail off, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the emotion behind it was too much to contain in words. Sarah looked away, staring at the 4-line in her arm. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Then how was I supposed to find out?" he asked, a little sharper than he meant to. "Or was I never supposed to know at all?" Silence thickened the room. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and stared down at them. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already on a different path. You were flying to Tokyo the next week. You had just closed that billion-dollar development deal. You barely slept, Nicholas. You were obsessed with making something big of yourself." He didn't deny it. She wasn't wrong. "I thought about telling you," she went on, her voice softer now. "But I kept imagining what would happen. You'd come back out of obligation. You'd resent me. You'd resent them. And I couldn't let them grow up feeling like someone's burden." Nicholas felt the words slice through him. He wanted to defend himself, to tell her that she had no right to decide for him, that he would have made it work, but part of him knew that back then, 6 years ago, he might have proved her fears right. "You should have given me the choice," he said, but his voice lacked anger now. It was just full of ache. She finally looked back at him, and in her expression he saw the weight of all the years she had carried alone. "I was wrong. I know that now," she said. "But I did what I thought was best." He sat in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Are they mine?" he asked, even though he already knew. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes. Both of them." Something in him unraveled. The certainty, the logic, the emotional armor he had built so carefully over the years, none of it mattered now. "I want to be part of their lives," he said, and he meant it with a clarity that surprised even himself. "But I need to know for sure. I'm going to do a DNA test. Not because I doubt you. I just need. I need to see it in writing." Sarah didn't argue. She simply nodded again. "Okay." Nicholas stood, suddenly unable to stay still. "I'll take care of the costs for your treatment. Whatever you need." "I didn't tell you so you'd rescue me," she said quickly, her voice regaining strength. "This isn't about money." "I know," he replied. "It's about them. And it's about not losing another day." He looked at her for a moment longer, then left the room quietly, the sound of his footsteps fading into the long, sterile hallway. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Harrison wasn't running toward profit or ambition. He was running toward the truth, toward two little girls with blue eyes and a mother who had done the impossible without him. And now, finally, he would not look away. The results came faster than Nicholas expected. His connections in the medical world had quietly expedited the DNA test, and now he sat alone in his apartment, a single sheet of paper resting on the counter in front of him like it held the power to shatter or complete him. He hadn't opened it yet. His hand hovered just above the page, and despite being a man used to making billion-dollar decisions without flinching, he felt paralyzed by a quiet kind of fear. Because deep down, he already knew what it would say. The mirror had told him. The girls' voices had told him. Sarah's face when he walked into that hospital room had told him. But seeing it on paper would make it real in a way nothing else could. When he finally unfolded the document, his eyes scanned the text without hesitation. The words jumped out at him in stark clarity. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Lily and Chloe were his daughters. Flesh and blood. Every carefully constructed wall around his heart seemed to collapse in silence. There were no tears, only an ache that went deeper than regret. It was the ache of years lost, of lullabies unsung, of birthdays missed and scraped knees he hadn't been there to soothe. He didn't waste time. The next morning, he returned to the hospital. The girls were there in the waiting room with a nurse, coloring quietly on a small table covered with markers and torn sheets. They looked up when he walked in, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Lily stood, brushing off her little dress like she was preparing for something important. She stared at him with the kind of seriousness only a child could have and asked, "Are you really our daddy?" Her voice didn't tremble. She asked like she needed the truth and wouldn't accept anything less. Chloe stood beside her, holding her hand, her bright blue eyes wide and cautious. Nicholas knelt in front of them, his voice catching in his throat for just a second before he found it. "Yes," he said softly. "I am." The girls stared at him for a moment longer, and then, in perfect unison, they stepped forward and wrapped their arms around his neck. The hug was clumsy and tight and everything. He closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The warmth of their small bodies, the way Chloe's fingers curled into his jacket, the way Lily's head pressed against his shoulder. He had never known a feeling like this. It was terrifying and overwhelming and indescribably right. They sat together for nearly an hour. He listened to them talk about their favorite cartoons, the names of their stuffed animals, and how the hospital food was gross. Chloe offered him one of her drawings, a crooked heart with the words, "For Mommy," scrawled in shaky letters across it. Lily told him he had to learn how to braid because she and Chloe hated when the nurse did their hair too tight. Nicholas promised he would learn. He meant it. Later, he spoke with Sarah. She looked stronger than she had a few days earlier, though still pale. When he told her the test confirmed what she already knew, she simply nodded. She hadn't needed proof, but she respected that he had. "They love you already," she said, not smiling, but not cold either. "They don't understand everything yet, but they know you're important." Nicholas didn't respond right away. He was staring at a photo taped to the wall beside Sarah's bed, a picture the girls had drawn of a house with 4 stick figures. One of them had dark brown hair and a tie. "I want to be here," he said finally. "Not for a few days. Not for appearances. I want to be their father in every way. I don't care how messy that gets. I missed enough already." Sarah's expression softened. "Then don't make promises you can't keep." "I won't," he said. "Not this time." When he left the hospital that day, Nicholas felt something new threading through his veins, not adrenaline, not control, not ambition. It was something quieter, stronger. It was the resolve of a man who had finally found what he hadn't even known he was missing. And he knew without question that whatever came next, whatever rebuilding had to happen, he would not walk away from this chance. Not again. Nicholas spent the following days adjusting to a rhythm of life that no meeting, spreadsheet, or strategy session could have prepared him for. Each morning began with a visit to the hospital, not out of obligation but because it had become the only place he truly wanted to be. Sarah's condition was gradually improving, though she still tired easily and sometimes had difficulty sitting up for more than a few minutes. The nurses grew accustomed to seeing Nicholas in the hallway, carrying juice boxes and coloring books, learning the small rituals of fatherhood one moment at a time. What amazed him most was how quickly Lily and Chloe had made room for him in their world. They didn't ask for explanations about why he hadn't been there before, and they didn't demand reassurances about whether he would stay. They simply accepted his presence with an unspoken trust that humbled him every time they reached for his hand or called his name across the room. One afternoon, as snow began to fall outside the hospital windows, Nicholas sat with the girls in the family room down the hall from Sarah's ward. Chloe had curled up on his lap and was busy showing him how to fold paper into crooked stars, while Lily sat across from them drawing a lopsided house with 4 stick figures inside. Nicholas watched her carefully add hair to each one, then label them with short names in large, uneven letters. The smallest one was marked Me, another, Chloe, the third Mommy, and finally, the tallest figure with brown hair was marked Daddy. When she held the picture up for him to see, pride lighting up her entire face, something shifted inside him so deeply he could hardly breathe. That night, after the girls were asleep and the room had gone quiet except for the soft hum of machines, Nicholas sat beside Sarah's bed while she dozed in and out of light sleep. She looked fragile under the thin hospital blanket, but there was still strength in her jaw, in the way her fingers twitched as if she were holding on to something invisible even as she rested. When she stirred and opened her eyes, she found him still there, leaning back in the chair, hands clasped in his lap. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to fill the space with explanations or apologies. The silence had become familiar, not uncomfortable. Eventually, Sarah said, "They've never had this before. A father, I mean. Just me, and sometimes that wasn't enough." Nicholas looked at her and said quietly, "I think you've done more than enough." She shook her head. "No. I've kept them safe and loved, but they've always looked at other families like they were watching something they didn't quite understand. Now they look at you like something clicked. Like a missing piece just fell into place." He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded slowly. "I want to be that piece. I don't expect it to be simple. I know I can't undo the years we lost." "They don't expect you to," Sarah said. "They just want to know you're real. And that you'll still be there tomorrow." Nicholas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the weariness of the week settling into his bones. "I will be. I don't want to be anywhere else." Sarah smiled faintly, the corners of her lips turning up just enough to soften her face. "You've changed." "I had to," he replied. "They deserve someone better than who I was." When she fell back asleep, Nicholas didn't leave. He sat in the dim light of the hospital room, watching the snow swirl past the window, thinking about everything he hadn't known he'd missed. He thought about birthday candles, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and little hands reaching up for his. He thought about how close he'd come to never knowing any of it. In that quiet moment, he made a decision. Not a fleeting one born of guilt or fear, but a deep, unshakable commitment. He would be there, not just as a visitor or a helper, but as a father in every sense of the word. He had spent years mastering power and control, only to realize that the truest strength came not from dominating the world, but from being willing to love without condition. And that's exactly what he intended to do. After a week of steady improvement, Sarah was released from the hospital, and Nicholas found himself suddenly standing at the edge of a reality he hadn't fully prepared for. He had spent days in the safe, structured in-between of hospital routines, visits, drawings, nurse check-ins, but now, with Sarah back in her apartment and the girls home full-time, everything shifted. The stakes felt higher, the quiet more fragile, the demands more personal. Sarah's apartment was small and neat, full of signs of love but also of struggle, an aging couch patched with fabric, children's artwork covering the walls, and stacks of bills in the kitchen corner that she quickly tucked away when he entered. She had always been proud. That hadn't changed. Nicholas arrived the morning after her release with groceries he'd never have purchased himself just months ago, cereal with cartoon animals on the box, juice boxes, pasta shaped like animals. He wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was something. The girls greeted him with sleepy smiles, their hair wild from sleep, and he helped them pour milk into bowls while Sarah rested in her room. Chloe insisted on sitting in his lap during breakfast, and Lily told him all about a dream she had where he built them a pink house with a slide instead of stairs. He nodded seriously and said, "We'll look into that," and both girls squealed with laughter. It was absurd and perfect. When Sarah emerged, moving slowly and with obvious effort, Nicholas offered to take the girls out for a few hours to let her rest. At first, she hesitated. He could see it in her eyes, that old instinct to protect and control everything because she'd had no other choice. But she nodded, and before long, he was loading Lily and Chloe into his car, adjusting their seatbelts and asking if they liked cartoons or music better. They chose both. The park was mostly empty that morning, the air crisp but not too cold, and Nicholas walked behind them as they raced ahead, their tiny sneakers kicking up leaves. He felt strangely exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't in a boardroom or in front of investors. He was just a man trailing after two little girls who called him daddy now, and the weight of that word followed him with every step. At one point, Lily fell and scraped her knee, and the sound of her cry cut through him more sharply than any financial loss ever had. He rushed forward, heart pounding, and picked her up with a gentleness he hadn't known lived in his hands. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed while Chloe stood beside them, fiercely holding her sister's hand. Nicholas wiped away tears, kissed the top of her head, and whispered over and over, "You're okay, I've got you," until she finally quieted. That moment changed something in him. It was no longer about proving he could be their father. It was about being someone they could fall into without hesitation, someone whose arms meant safety. Later, back at the apartment, he made dinner, something simple and slightly overcooked, but the girls cheered like it was a feast. Sarah sat at the kitchen table watching, her eyes softer now, her walls slowly coming down. After the girls were asleep, Nicholas lingered in the living room. He felt like he didn't want to leave, like going back to his cold, minimalist condo would be like stepping into a life that no longer fit him. Sarah sat beside him on the couch, wrapping a blanket over her lap, and they talked in quiet voices about the girls, about the past, about the messiness of everything. She told him how lonely it had been, how many nights she'd stayed up wondering if she'd made the right choice in hiding the truth, and he told her that he wasn't angry anymore. Sad, yes. But not angry. He understood now. When he finally stood to go, Sarah surprised him. She reached out and touched his arm lightly, her fingers trembling just a little. "You're doing okay," she said. "They're happy." Nicholas looked at her, the tired honesty in her eyes, and felt something inside him settle. "I want this," he said. "All of it. I know I wasn't there before, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." She didn't say anything, but she nodded, and in that nod was the beginning of something new, something built not on the past, but on the promise of what could still be. As Nicholas walked out into the cool night air, he realized that for the first time in years, he felt full. Not with success or control or recognition, but with something real. Something worth every sacrifice he hadn't known he would ever be willing to make. Winter had fully taken hold of the city, dressing the streets in a thin layer of frost and turning the breath of passers-by into brief clouds in the air. Nicholas found himself adjusting to a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and comforting. His days, once strictly segmented into meetings, deadlines, and jet-setting across continents, were now structured by simpler things: school drop-offs, bedtime stories, lunch boxes with handwritten notes inside. He was still CEO, still answering emails and reviewing contracts, but the sharp edge of his ambition had softened. His attention was no longer divided by default. It had simply shifted. There was no confusion in his mind now about what mattered more. Every morning began the same way. He would arrive at Sarah's apartment just after 7, always with something warm, bagels, pancakes, or oatmeal with bananas the way Chloe liked it. The girls would greet him in mismatched pajamas, hair sticking up in odd directions, and he'd help them get dressed while Sarah drank her tea slowly at the kitchen table, still regaining strength but already more alive than he remembered her being in those sterile hospital rooms. He noticed things: how Lily liked her socks pulled up just below the knee, how Chloe always put her shoes on the wrong feet first, how Sarah watched them both with a mother's pride that she no longer tried to hide from him. These details grounded him in ways he didn't expect. One afternoon, while Sarah was resting and the girls were napping, Nicholas stood in the quiet apartment and looked around. Toys were scattered across the rug. A crayon drawing hung crookedly on the fridge. The air smelled faintly of apple-scented soap and lavender laundry detergent. He realized with startling clarity that this was the first space in years that actually felt like home. Not his penthouse with sleek furniture and museum-like silence, but this small, slightly messy place filled with noise and breath and warmth. Later that evening, the four of them sat together on the floor building a puzzle. It was a scene of a colorful farm with too many sky pieces and missing corners, but the girls didn't care. Nicholas found himself laughing, real laughter, the kind that made his ribs hurt and tears prick at his eyes. When Chloe asked if he had ever done puzzles when he was little, he shook his head and said he couldn't remember. She looked at him very seriously and said, "Well, you can remember now. With us." That moment stayed with him long after the puzzle was packed away. The next morning, Sarah handed him a stack of envelopes. He raised an eyebrow, confused, and she simply said, "Bills. Things I haven't had the energy to open." There was no shame in her voice, no bitterness. Just honesty. Nicholas took them without a word and went through each one that evening, making calls, setting up payments, clearing debts she had carried alone for years. It wasn't about money. It was about stepping fully into the space she had guarded alone for too long and saying, without needing to say it, that she wasn't alone anymore. That night, Sarah stood in the kitchen while he loaded the dishwasher. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. After a moment, she said, "You're good with them. I didn't expect that." He paused, closing the dishwasher door with a quiet click. "Neither did I," he admitted. She smiled then, the kind of small, private smile that said she was still figuring out what to make of all this. "They love you, you know," she said softly. "They don't understand the past, but they understand who you are to them now." Nicholas looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper in his eyes. "I want them to grow up knowing they're never alone. I want them to know that someone will always show up, no matter what." Sarah walked over to him and placed her hand gently on his chest, just over his heart. "Then you're already doing it." In the stillness that followed, Nicholas realized he had finally arrived at something he had chased his entire adult life. It wasn't a promotion or a title or a number in a bank account. It was this: being seen, being needed, being part of something unshakably real. And he wasn't going to let it go. December rolled in quietly, and with it came the buzz of Christmas lights strung over city streets, paper snowflakes taped to apartment windows, and the constant sound of carols drifting from storefronts. For Nicholas, this season had always been just another quarter to close, an opportunity for end-of-year financial wins, corporate parties filled with shallow laughter, and obligatory charity galas. But this year, everything felt different. His days were now filled with the kind of anticipation he hadn't experienced since childhood, except this time, it wasn't about presents under a tree. It was about making memories, creating something lasting for Lily and Chloe that would prove, again and again, he was here to stay. He had never decorated a Christmas tree in his life, but when Sarah mentioned, half joking, that they would be using their tiny artificial tree again this year, Nicholas showed up the next morning with a real pine tree strapped to the roof of his car and a trunk full of ornaments, garlands, and a star that lit up. The girls screamed when they saw it, running circles around the living room, while Sarah stood in the doorway, one hand over her mouth, torn between laughing and crying. He helped them set it up, guiding their small hands as they hung glittering baubles too close together, letting them place 3 different stars on the top before finally agreeing which one stayed. It was chaos and glitter and joy. Sarah was quieter that week. She watched him often, studying the way he moved through their home, how naturally the girls now reached for him, how quickly he had folded himself into the rhythm of their lives. One night, after the girls had gone to sleep, she asked him to take a walk. The cold air bit at their faces as they walked side by side down the block, the glow of streetlights painting their shadows onto the sidewalk. She didn't speak for a long time, and Nicholas let the silence be, waiting without pressure, his hands tucked deep in his coat pockets. Finally, she said, "I keep waiting for it to fall apart. For you to wake up one day and remember who you were before this. That you were never meant to stay." Her voice wasn't accusing, just tired, honest, fragile. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I did remember who I was. And that's why I'm here. Because that man, he had everything but lived like nothing mattered. I didn't know what I was missing until I saw their faces. Until I saw you again." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her posture changed. She wasn't bracing anymore. She was listening, not just to his words but to what had shifted in him over these weeks. "They need you," she said. "But don't forget, I do too. Just not in the way I used to." Nicholas nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she meant. They weren't returning to what they once had. This was something new. It would take time. It would require patience neither of them had needed before. But it was worth it. On Christmas Eve, Nicholas surprised them with a small gathering. Nothing extravagant, just a warm dinner, stockings he had helped the girls hang, and a few close friends of Sarah's who had helped her through the hardest years. He stood beside her in the kitchen as the girls tore into their gifts, the sound of paper ripping and laughter echoing through the apartment. He looked at Sarah, who leaned lightly against him, and for a moment, it felt like they had always been this way. Like the years apart had simply paused what had always been meant to continue. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the girls were tucked in bed clutching their new toys, Nicholas and Sarah sat in the soft glow of the Christmas tree. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. The peace that filled the room was louder than any conversation. When he reached over and took her hand in his, she didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "You kept your promise." And he had. For the first time in his life, he had shown up not to fix something, not to impress, not to win, but simply to stay. Spring came slowly that year, washing away the gray of winter with soft winds and longer days. By April, the city had thawed, and tulips were blooming in sidewalk planters, their bright colors spilling over like confetti. In the apartment Sarah once held together with quiet strength and cautious hope, life had begun to look different. The walls were still covered in crayon drawings, but now there were framed photos too, pictures of Lily and Chloe on Nicholas's shoulders at the zoo, Sarah smiling from the hospital bed while the girls piled beside her, and even one that Nicholas had taken himself of all 4 of them baking cookies, flour dusted across every surface and smile. Nicholas had made good on every promise, not through grand declarations but through the quiet persistence of showing up. He helped with science projects, learned how to braid hair, badly, and spent Sunday mornings building blanket forts in the living room. He still ran his company, still wore suits and signed contracts, but something fundamental had shifted in how he moved through the world. He no longer measured success by quarterly growth or market expansions but by how many bedtime stories he read, how often the girls laughed so hard they fell over, and whether Sarah let her guard down just a little more than the day before. One afternoon, Sarah invited him to walk with her to the park. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but it was one of those perfect spring days when the air smelled like new beginnings. The girls raced ahead, chasing each other with plastic pinwheels, while Nicholas and Sarah strolled behind them. There was something easy between them now, something earned. She told him she was considering going back to work part-time once the girls started school full days in the fall, and he encouraged her, offering to rearrange his schedule so he could do pickups or drop-offs. It was casual, seamless, like they had already become a team in all the small, meaningful ways that mattered most. At the playground, Nicholas pushed Chloe on the swings while Lily climbed across the monkey bars and shouted for him to watch. Sarah sat on the bench nearby, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes warm and calm. She hadn't said it yet, not out loud, but he could feel it in her gaze, in the way she no longer flinched when he made plans involving them months down the line. She believed in him now, not just as the man he had become but as the father he had chosen to be. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep with arms flung across their pillows and storybooks open on their chests, Sarah and Nicholas sat on the fire escape, a blanket around their shoulders and mugs of tea warming their hands. They talked about the girls, about summer plans, about nothing and everything. The city stretched around them, alive and distant, but their world had become something smaller and infinitely more important. At one point, Sarah turned to him, her voice low but clear, and said, "I didn't think we'd get here. I thought too much had happened. That you wouldn't want this, or worse, that you'd want it for the wrong reasons." Nicholas didn't rush to answer. He looked out over the quiet street, the glow of the street lamp catching the gold in her hair. "I wanted success for so long because I thought it would fix what was empty inside me," he said. "But it never did. Then I met them, and it wasn't just that I wanted to be in their lives. I needed to be. They showed me the version of myself I was always meant to be, and I don't want to be anyone else now." Sarah reached out and touched his hand, and there was no hesitation in it. He turned his palm up and laced their fingers together. There was no big speech, no dramatic declaration. Just two people, broken in their own ways, choosing each other again, not because they had to, but because they knew the cost of not doing so. Months later, in a small garden behind their new home, Lily and Chloe ran barefoot through the grass while Nicholas assembled a crooked swing set, and Sarah watched with her feet up and a lemonade in hand. It wasn't a picture-perfect life. There were still late nights and tantrums, dishes that piled up, and moments of doubt. But there was also laughter and trust, and more love than Nicholas ever thought he'd be capable of giving or receiving. He had spent years building skyscrapers, collecting accolades, becoming someone people admired from a distance. But none of it compared to the sound of his daughters calling him daddy or the way Sarah looked at him when she knew he wasn't going anywhere. That was the legacy he wanted now, not glass towers, but a home with lights in the windows and voices in the hallway. Not power, but presence. Not perfection, but family. This story ends where it truly begins, with a man who once measured his worth by deals and deadlines learning that real value lies in presence, not power. What moved me most about Nicholas's journey wasn't the dramatic reveal or even the emotional reunion, but the quiet, persistent transformation that happened through everyday moments, spilled juice, bedtime routines, scraped knees. His redemption didn't come from grand gestures, but from showing up, over and over, until love became habit and family became home. It's a reminder that healing is possible even after long silence, and that sometimes the life we were meant for is waiting exactly where we never thought to look. He had everything, power, wealth, control, until a quiet cleaning girl shattered his perfect world with nothing but honesty. Lily Brooks moved through the 28th floor of the Hale building like a shadow, quiet, efficient, invisible. She had learned long ago that the less she was seen, the easier everything became. No one asked questions if you kept your head down. No one stared too long if you never made eye contact. And in a world of suits and skyscrapers and people who spoke in stock prices and mergers, a girl with a cleaning cart didn't exist unless she made a mistake. That night had started like every other. The office lights were mostly off, the air carried a faint chill from the overactive AC, and Lily moved with practiced steps through the silent space of one of Chicago's most powerful firms. She always began with the windows, working her way in, never touching desks unless absolutely necessary. She wore gloves, tied her hair back tight, and avoided her reflection in the glass. She had just finished wiping down a glass wall when she heard a sound, footsteps. Her body instinctively tensed. No one was ever there this late, at least not on this floor. She turned, and that's when she saw him. Grayson Hale. The Grayson Hale. He stood near the edge of the office with his phone to his ear, coat off, sleeves rolled, and a look on his face that could slice steel. He was taller than she expected, broader in the shoulders, and more intense up close. She had seen his photo before, plastered across business magazines and screens in the lobby, but this was different. Here, in person, there was a quiet ferocity to him, like a storm disguised in tailored wool. She instantly looked down and turned to leave, but in her rush, she bumped her cart, sending a glass tumbler from a nearby side table crashing to the floor. It shattered loudly, painfully loud in the stillness. She froze. He turned. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then he took a step toward the shards, but she stepped in front of him. "Wait," she said, the word small but firm. He blinked, surprised. "You'll cut yourself," she added, already crouching, already gathering the bigger pieces with gloved hands. He stood there, watching her. Something about her tone, the way she didn't panic, didn't apologize or beg, but simply moved with purpose, it caught him off guard. Most people around him stammered, tried to impress, acted like his presence changed the rules of reality. She didn't do any of that. She just cleaned up a mess like it was part of the job and never looked up once. Grayson said nothing. After a moment, he walked back to his desk, picked up his phone, and continued his conversation as if nothing had happened. But for the rest of the night, he kept glancing up from time to time, eyes flicking toward the woman who moved like silence itself, sweeping glass off the floor and fading into the background like she had always belonged there, until suddenly, she didn't. Because now he had seen her. And something about that felt different. Something about her didn't fit the story he'd written for this office, this building, or himself. And he wasn't sure why, but he knew he wouldn't be able to unsee her again. Grayson hadn't expected to think about her again. The moment with the broken glass should have been forgettable, just another minor disruption in an otherwise meticulous day. But the image of her crouched calmly among the shards, her expression steady and without fear, kept replaying in his mind like a loop he couldn't silence. He didn't even know her name, yet something about her presence had unsettled his equilibrium. He told himself it was curiosity, the same way he might briefly notice a design flaw in a building and not rest until it was corrected. Only this time, it wasn't about flaw. It was about mystery. About a woman who had entered his line of sight and didn't immediately shrink or inflate beneath it. The next evening, he stayed late again. Not intentionally, not at first. At least, that's what he told himself when he declined a dinner invitation and kept working past 9. The office was quieter than usual, the city below humming with its usual neon rhythm. And just like before, at 9:45 sharp, she appeared. He watched from behind a glass wall as she pushed the cleaning cart through the doors and disappeared into the far hallway. No hesitation in her steps, no recognition of being observed. She wore the same dark blue uniform, her hair pinned back in a low knot, her focus absolute. This time, he didn't look away. Half an hour passed. She hadn't reached his office yet. He told himself to leave, that he had no reason to sit around watching someone mop floors. But he didn't move. Not until she finally entered, wiping down the glass wall across from his desk. She didn't glance at him, didn't pause. Her posture remained firm and focused. But he could tell she knew he was there. The air between them had shifted slightly, the tension delicate but undeniable. He cleared his throat. You were here last night, he said, regretting the awkwardness in his voice the second the words left his mouth. She looked up, not startled, not even surprised. I'm here every night, she said, matter-of-factly. Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet strength that somehow made the words land harder than they should have. He nodded slowly. I don't usually notice. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, tired, knowing. Most people don't. He should have ended it there, should have let her finish her work and vanish back into anonymity. But he didn't. What's your name? Lily. She didn't offer a last name. Didn't ask for his. He liked that. He stood and crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from her. I'm Grayson, he said, even though she clearly already knew. Her expression didn't change. I know. A silence fell between them that wasn't uncomfortable, just oddly still. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't ask why he was talking to her. She simply waited. So he asked, why do you do this? She blinked. Because it pays the bills. No, he said quickly, I mean, you seem smart. Capable. There are easier ways to make a living. She tilted her head slightly. And what makes you think I haven't chosen this for a reason? He had no answer for that. He didn't like being cornered, but something about her tone wasn't challenging, it was honest. She finished wiping the glass, turned, and said gently, not everyone with value stands on the 38th floor in a suit. Then she nodded politely, pushed her cart past him, and disappeared down the hallway. Grayson stood still for a long time, feeling like a man who had just heard a language he didn't speak but somehow understood. It wasn't the cleaning that intrigued him. It was the clarity. The way she had said it. Like she'd already seen people like him before, and nothing about his name, money, or power impressed her. And instead of offending him, that thought lit a spark he hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just someone passing through his space. She had just shifted something in it. And in him. Grayson found himself doing something he had once considered beneath him, waiting for someone who had no title, no resume he'd reviewed, no strategic value to his business. Each night he stayed later than necessary, staring blankly at spreadsheets or pretending to read memos, all while listening for the soft squeak of wheels rolling down polished floors. Lily never made much noise, and yet he began to anticipate the rhythm of her arrival like it was something sacred. He didn't understand it, not fully, but he didn't question it either. There was something steadying about her presence, something grounding in the way she moved with purpose but never rush, focus but never stress. She existed in her own world, separate from the chaos he had created around himself, and somehow that made her the only real thing in it. One evening he decided he couldn't keep pretending. When she stepped into his office with her usual calmness, he was already standing, not behind his desk, not on the phone, just waiting. She looked at him once, registered his presence, and continued wiping the corner windows without a word. He didn't speak immediately. He just watched her, trying to understand what it was about her that unsettled him in a way no investor ever had. Finally, he said, "What do you want to do with your life?" She stopped mid-wipe and looked at him, clearly unamused. "You think cleaning isn't living?" He shook his head. "That's not what I meant." She sighed and leaned slightly against the windowsill, still holding the cloth. "I'm studying. At night. Nursing. I work here to pay tuition. I clean offices because they're quiet and no one bothers me." Grayson was quiet for a moment. "Why nursing?" Her expression softened just a little. "Because when I was 8, I was in a foster home and got pneumonia. A nurse stayed with me all night, long after her shift ended. She held my hand and told me I was going to be okay. No one else did that. I want to be that person for someone else." He didn't know what to say to that. He'd heard thousands of elevator pitches, grand ambitions soaked in ego, but nothing like this, simple, direct, and full of meaning. He suddenly felt like everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, was hollow in comparison to a girl with a mop who wanted to become someone else's safe place. "You could have said you want to help people," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "I just did." "You were listening." He crossed his arms. "You don't look like someone who needs help, but I think you've given me more clarity in 5 minutes than I've had in 5 years. She didn't react. She just turned back to the glass, her voice quiet. "You're not the first powerful man to say that. Most of them don't mean it." He flinched slightly, unsure if he should be offended or impressed. "Probably both. What makes you think I don't?" She glanced back at him. "Because you're still standing here asking questions like I'm a puzzle to solve. Maybe I'm just a person. Maybe you don't need to understand everything." That struck deeper than he expected. He was a man addicted to logic, driven by control. And here she was, offering him no handholds, no formulas, only truth. Pure, honest, unpolished truth. He admired that. And it terrified him. Lily returned to her work without waiting for a reply, as if the moment didn't require one. Grayson remained where he was, watching her finish the windows, collect her things, and leave without looking back. He realized then that the high-rise walls he'd built around himself weren't glass, they were mirrors. And in Lily's reflection, he didn't like what he saw. Not because of her judgment. But because, for the first time, someone had seen through him completely, and walked away with nothing but dignity. And that, somehow, made her unforgettable. Grayson couldn't stop thinking about her. He didn't like admitting that, even to himself, but there it was, undeniable and persistent. In a world where everything made sense, where numbers followed patterns and people followed rules, Lily Brooks had become the exception that refused to fit inside his calculations. He caught himself anticipating her shift schedule, noticing the days she wasn't there, feeling a hollow kind of silence when her cart didn't squeak softly past his office door. It wasn't infatuation, at least not in the way he used to understand it. It was something more unsettling. She had become a mirror he hadn't asked for, one that reflected parts of himself he'd avoided for years. At the next board meeting, his focus faltered. Someone mentioned projections, another spoke about a new merger possibility, and Grayson nodded in all the right places but absorbed none of it. His mind wandered to Lily's voice, the way she had said maybe she wasn't a puzzle to solve, maybe she was just a person. It rattled in his chest like a truth he wasn't ready to unpack. Later that week, he did something he never did, he stepped into the building's staff lounge. It was small, tucked behind the service elevators, and smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and burnt coffee. He didn't linger, didn't ask anyone questions, just scanned the list taped to the wall near the lockers until he found her full name. Lily Brooks. It was strange how seeing it typed out made her more real, as if now he was no longer watching a mystery but learning a person. And it made something ache inside him, a sensation unfamiliar and inconvenient. That evening, she came earlier than usual. He was in the hallway near the executive suites when he saw her pushing the cart, earbuds in, eyes down. For a second, he just stood there watching her approach, and she didn't notice him until she almost passed by. She removed one earbud, eyebrows raised slightly. "Lost?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just thinking." She paused, then resumed moving. "Dangerous thing for a man like you." He walked beside her, his pace slower, unsure why he was even following. "You talk like you know me." She didn't stop, but her tone sharpened just a little. "I know your type." He frowned, almost defensive. "And what type is that?" "The kind who thinks they see everything from the top floor. But never notices who holds the door open on the ground level." He fell silent. They reached the end of the hallway, and she began sorting her supplies. He watched her quietly, then said, "That night, when you talked about nursing. That was the most honest thing I've heard in years." She didn't look at him. Honesty doesn't mean much when people aren't listening. I was. She finally met his gaze. Her expression was calm but not soft. Then why are you still pretending this is a game? He didn't know how to answer, because she was right. Part of him was still approaching her like a challenge, like an equation he hadn't cracked yet. But the more time he spent near her, the more he understood that she wasn't something to win, she was someone to respect. And he hadn't earned that yet. Grayson stepped back, hands in his pockets. I'm not trying to play you. I know, she said quietly. But I don't think you know what you are trying. And that's what makes this dangerous. She didn't say it with anger. There was no edge in her voice, no accusation. Just tired truth. He watched her gather her rags and move on, and for once he didn't follow. He stood in the hallway long after she disappeared, realizing something that shook him more than he expected. For years he'd been surrounded by people who lied to his face and flattered his ego. And here was someone who told him the truth and walked away. Not because she didn't care. But because she valued herself too much to be someone's project. That night, Grayson Hale sat alone in his penthouse and stared at his own reflection for a long time, wondering if for once in his life, he was willing to become someone worthy of a woman who didn't need him at all. Grayson never asked anyone for advice. He had built an empire on instinct, control, and an iron belief in his own judgment. But for the first time in years, he found himself hesitating, unsure not just of what move to make, but of what he even wanted. Lily had shaken something loose in him, something raw and unfamiliar. Her words haunted him not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. She didn't admire him the way others did. She didn't bend toward his influence or flinch at his reputation. And that resistance, that quiet integrity, made her unforgettable. He didn't want to lose her, but he also didn't know how to approach her without making her feel like she was being studied or pursued. His team noticed the shift. He was still present, still sharp, but he had lost that brutal edge he'd once wielded like a weapon. Meetings were shorter. His temper didn't snap as easily. And he had started saying thank you, to assistants, to security guards, even to the barista in the lobby cafe. People murmured behind his back. Jason, his closest advisor and oldest friend, finally asked what was going on. Grayson didn't answer at first. Then, one night, over a drink neither of them had time for, he said quietly, "There's someone I can't stop thinking about. And she has no idea how many people would kill for that kind of hold on me." Jason, to his credit, didn't laugh. He just looked at Grayson for a long moment and asked, "Is she the kind of woman who wants to hold you? Or the kind who needs you to stop being someone you're not?" That question sat in his chest like a weight. The next night, Grayson waited until Lily was alone. He didn't corner her. He didn't make demands. He simply stepped into the break room where she was folding rags and said, "Can we talk?" She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look up right away. When she finally met his eyes, there was no fear, only quiet exhaustion. "If this is another moment where you try to figure me out, I don't have the energy for it tonight." He stepped closer, slower than usual, hands out of his pockets for once, as if trying to show he came with nothing hidden. No figuring out. Just honesty. For once, no angle. She gave him a long look. "Okay. Say what you came to say." He took a breath, a real one, deeper than he'd taken in weeks. "You're the only person who's ever made me question who I am and not hate it. You've made me realize that success isn't the same as substance. That power doesn't make me whole. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't even know if I deserve your time. But I want it. And I want you to know that I'm not here because I'm curious. I'm here because I can't stop thinking about what it would mean to be seen by you the way you see the world." She didn't respond right away. He expected silence. Or rejection. But she surprised him. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" she asked softly. He nodded. I see someone who's never let anyone close enough to disappoint him. I see someone who's terrified of being human because he spent too long trying to be invincible. And I see someone who's not used to hearing no. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. And what would happen if I told you I want to try to change that? She paused, then folded the last rag slowly. Then I'd say don't try to impress me. Show me. And not for one night. Not until the novelty wears off. But day after day. Quietly. Honestly. Without expecting anything in return. Grayson nodded. I can do that. She tilted her head slightly. I don't need you to. I need you to want to. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him in the fluorescent light with nothing but the echo of her voice and the unfamiliar, slow-blooming feeling that maybe, for the first time in his life, love wasn't something to be earned, it was something to become. Grayson started showing up differently. Not loudly. Not with declarations or dramatic gestures. He simply adjusted the way he moved through his own world. Where he used to walk through his building with the kind of purposeful detachment that made people clear out of his path, now he paused in hallways, greeted people by name, and looked them in the eye. It wasn't performative. It was deliberate. He had spent so long building walls that even he couldn't remember what was on the other side of them. But Lily had seen right through them, and instead of bracing against the exposure, he began to lean into it. He made space in his day for moments that had nothing to do with profit, real conversations, handwritten notes, small kindnesses that went unnoticed by most but not by her. He didn't speak to Lily again right away. She had been clear, words were not what she needed. She didn't want apologies, promises, or charm. She wanted consistency, real effort, and proof that he could be someone without the armor of his title. So that's what he gave. He started volunteering on weekends at the free clinic where she trained part-time as a student nurse. He didn't tell her. He just showed up, helped move boxes, cleaned floors, sat in the back of the room during first aid workshops and took notes as if he were the one being tested. When she saw him for the first time in that setting, her eyes widened for half a second, but she didn't say a word. She just handed him a clipboard and walked away. The silence didn't bother him anymore. It gave him space to understand her world without demanding access. He watched the way she spoke to patients, listened to elderly volunteers, and stayed long after her shift had ended to help clean up. She didn't seek praise. She didn't even seem to notice how much good she did. She just kept showing up. And every time she did, Grayson found himself feeling less like the man who had once towered above others and more like someone who wanted to stand beside her. His partners began to question his priorities. Jason pulled him aside after a board meeting and asked, "Are you trying to sabotage your own image?" Grayson smiled for the first time in weeks and answered, "I'm trying to build a better one." The truth was, he no longer cared if his reputation suffered. For years he'd been worshipped for the wrong things, his ruthlessness, his success, his ability to win at all costs. But Lily had reminded him that winning alone wasn't winning at all. One night, after a long day at the clinic, Grayson waited outside in the fading evening light. Lily walked out with her bag slung over her shoulder, hair loose from the clip she wore during shifts. She looked tired but content. When she saw him leaning against the wall, she slowed her pace, unsure whether to walk past him or stop. He said nothing at first, just met her eyes and offered a quiet smile. Then he said, "I'm not following you. I'm just here. Still." She exhaled, her expression softening. "I noticed." He took a step closer, not imposing, just present. "I don't want to be a man who only changes when someone is watching. I want to be different even when you're not looking." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Keep going." He tilted his head. "Going where?" She smiled faintly. "Wherever this leads. If it's real, you'll find the way." If it's not, you'll stop. And I won't have to tell you. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't ask for more. He simply stood there with her in the quiet evening, letting her words settle inside him like a new kind of map. One without shortcuts. One he was finally ready to follow without rushing. The weeks that followed moved slowly, but with purpose. Grayson began measuring his days not by meetings closed or targets met, but by the moments that felt unpolished and real. He still ran his company, still made decisions that shaped entire skylines, but somewhere between boardrooms and late-night emails, he found himself learning to listen better, to speak less, and to observe the world around him instead of trying to dominate it. He kept volunteering at the clinic, even when Lily wasn't there, not for recognition, but because the quiet work grounded him. He learned the names of the nurses, the patients, the regulars who came not just for care but for connection. He swept floors, helped restock shelves, carried boxes, and sat in on training sessions like a man who knew he had more to learn than he'd ever been taught. Lily didn't make it easy. She never gave him a clear signal, never told him what she was thinking, and never made him feel like her affection was guaranteed. But she also didn't push him away. They began to speak more, slowly, in fragments of real conversation that felt heavier than anything he'd exchanged in all his years of networking. She told him about her childhood in foster care, the families that came and went, the nights she'd studied by flashlight in crowded shelters. She talked about failure, not as a shameful thing, but as something familiar, like a quiet sibling she had learned to live with. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. About the pressure to succeed, about a father who measured love in achievements, and about the coldness he had mistaken for strength for most of his adult life. She listened, not with pity, but with that same unwavering stillness that had first drawn him in. It felt like standing under clear water, nothing hidden, everything exposed, and somehow still safe. One evening, as they locked up the clinic together, Grayson noticed her hand trembling slightly. When he asked if she was okay, she hesitated before admitting that her mentor, the same nurse who had inspired her all those years ago, had fallen ill. It wasn't public knowledge yet, and Lily wasn't sure how to help or whether she could at all. Grayson didn't try to fix it, didn't offer money or connections. He just said, "Tell me what you need," and meant it. She asked him to drive her across town the next morning to visit the woman in the hospital. He said yes before she finished the sentence. That visit changed something. Watching Lily with the woman who had once saved her, seeing the tenderness in her voice and the strength in her stillness, Grayson understood something he hadn't before. Love wasn't in the gestures or the words. It was in the presence, in the silence you were willing to share without needing to fill it. He watched Lily hold the woman's hand, whisper something only the two of them could hear, and he realized that for all his wealth and influence, he had never been part of a moment that pure. On the way back, they didn't speak much. She rested her head against the window and he just drove, the city unfolding in soft golds and blues around them. When he pulled up in front of her building, she didn't get out right away. She looked at him and said, "You stayed." He looked back and replied, "You made it easy to." She nodded once, then leaned over, not for a kiss, not for anything romantic or staged, but to rest her head against his shoulder, just for a moment. In that small, quiet gesture, everything that needed to be said was said. That night, Grayson didn't go back to his penthouse. He drove through the city until the lights blurred and the air turned cool, thinking not about how far he had come, but about how much further he was willing to go. Not for success. Not even for her. But for himself. Because for the first time in his life, becoming someone better felt more important than being someone powerful. And if she chose to meet him at that version of himself, when he got there, he would be ready. Autumn rolled into the city with golden light and quieter streets, and for the first time in years, Grayson allowed himself to slow down. Not out of obligation or exhaustion, but because he had finally come to understand that life wasn't a race, and love certainly wasn't a prize to win. He no longer felt the same compulsion to fill every hour with deals or push every moment toward a measurable goal. The world hadn't stopped turning around him, but somehow, it felt softer, more open. He still worked. He still led. But now, he also walked. He lingered. He noticed things. And more than anything else, he noticed her. Lily had let him in slowly, but when she did, it wasn't with hesitation, it was with quiet courage. She never expected perfection from him. She didn't want grand gestures or promises engraved in stone. What mattered to her was what he did when no one was watching, the way he handled people who could do nothing for him, the way he carried her world without trying to reshape it. Their relationship grew not from declarations, but from 1,000 small choices, showing up early to help at the clinic, leaving her notes when she was too tired to talk, bringing soup to her apartment when her mentor's condition worsened, staying through it all without asking for anything in return. Her mentor passed away in late October, and Lily disappeared for 3 days. No texts. No calls. Grayson didn't chase her, but he waited. When she returned, eyes red but posture steady, he opened his door without asking for an explanation and let her cry into his chest for as long as she needed. She didn't speak until sunrise, and when she did, all she said was, "Thank you for not asking me to be okay." He held her tighter, understanding that sometimes love meant knowing when not to speak. In November, she passed her nursing exams with distinction. Grayson threw her a small dinner with the staff from the clinic, a few volunteers, and Jason, who had become surprisingly supportive over the months. During a quiet moment at the table, Jason leaned over and said to Grayson, "She changed you." Grayson shook his head slightly and replied, "She reminded me who I might have been if I'd learned to care sooner." By December, Lily had accepted a job offer at a new nonprofit medical outreach program. The building was old, underfunded, and far from glamorous, but her eyes lit up every time she talked about it. Grayson offered to help discreetly, and to his surprise, she said yes. Not because she needed him, but because she trusted him now. That simple shift meant everything. They were no longer two people from different worlds colliding, they had become partners in the same one they were quietly building together. On the first snow of the season, he asked her if she wanted to leave the city for a while. Just the two of them. No plans. No meetings. Just space to breathe. She agreed, and they spent a week in a lakeside cabin where mornings were filled with firewood and tea, and nights were spent reading or simply existing in silence that felt warm, not empty. On the last night, as snow fell thick and quiet outside, Grayson looked at her across the small table and said, "You're not just the woman who changed me. You're the woman who showed me I was allowed to change." She smiled, tired and glowing in the candlelight. "You did the work. I just didn't get in the way." He reached across the table, took her hand, and for the first time, said something he'd never said to anyone, not even in past relationships. "I want to build a life with you. Not a future I control. A life we figure out as we go. One where you can always tell me when I've lost my way, and I promise to listen." She didn't answer with words. She stood up, walked around the table, and kissed him like she already knew everything he meant. The next morning, they drove back into the city, not as a CEO and a cleaning girl, but as two people who had found something rare and worth keeping. They didn't move in together right away. They didn't rush toward marriage. They just stayed. Every day. And in the world Grayson had once tried to conquer, he now walked quietly beside the only woman who had ever made him feel like home.